Hello, welcome to lesson 36. We're going to talk about the optative mood in the present and aorist tenses, active, middle, and passive voices. And we're going to look at two independent uses of the optative of wish and the potential optative. So the present optative is formed, as you might expect, on the first principal part of the verb. There's our stem, right? And the optative in general is characterized by this iota. Throughout the present, we're going to see this theme vowel, which is an omicron. But here are the endings. It's oimi, ois, oi, oimen, oite, oyen. That's the present optative active. And then in the middle, again, we see the theme vowel and that iota, and the secondary middle passive endings. So if you think back to the subjunctive used my, si, tai, methus, that, entai. The optative throughout is going to use secondary endings. So main, saw, ta, metha, stha, enta. Notice here the intervocalic sigma has dropped out. So we end up with the endings oimein, oio, oita, oimetha, oistha, oita. Now let's talk about contract verbs. Now contract verbs can use exactly the same endings that we just saw for verbs that aren't contract verbs. But in the active, they also have an alternative set of endings. And the alternative set of endings have ain, ace, a, amen, ata, ason. You may recognize those endings from the aorist passive indicative of regular verbs, right? So we've seen these personal endings before. So for contract verbs in the active, you have a choice of forms. These forms are more common in the singular. These forms are more common in the plural, but all of the forms are possible, okay? So you can have these blue forms that are just like parewa, and you can have the pink forms that have an oi plus a personal ending that looks just like the aorist passive indicative of parewa. Whichever endings you use, though, they're going to contract with the vowel at the end of the stem of the contract verb. So let's look first at timao. It's our example of an alpha contract. And we're only going to look at the active because remember, the middle passive, we're going to have the same exact contraction and the same exact endings we saw for the middle passive present of parewa. So we're just looking at the active. All right, so we know that alpha plus oi gives us omega with a iota subscript. So first, let's look at the more common forms. Timoyen, timoyes, timoye, timoimen, timoite, timoyen. Those are the more common forms. Now we'll look at the less common forms. Timoimi, timois, timoy, timoimen, timoyete, timoyesan. Okay. Now we'll look at epsilon contracts like phileo or poieo. All right, so for epsilon contracts, epsilon plus oi just gives us oi. So this is actually pretty easy. So first, the more common forms, philoien, philoies, philoie, philoimen, philoite, philoien, and the less common forms, philoimi, philois, philoi, philoiemen, philoite, philoieson. Okay, good. Finally, delao. We're not even going to talk about delao, and that's because Omicron plus oi also gives us oi. So these look just like phileo. So we're not going to worry about them. Okay, now, second aorist. This is much easier. So the optative, like the subjunctive, like participles and imperatives and infinitives, the optative doesn't have time, it just has aspect. So we're not going to use the augment. We have to take the augment off, and here's our stem, ball. And it uses exactly the same endings as paideo did in the present, right? Oimi, ois, oi, oimen, oite, oien in the active, and oimen, oio, oito, oimitha, oistha, ointa in the middle. Okay, so that's super easy. Although I have an extra accent there. Get rid of that. All right. Now let's talk about the first aorist. So again, here's our stem from the third principal part. Remove the augment. Again, we have alternative forms. So we can have just aimi, ice, I, aimen, ite, ien. That looks very like the oimi, ois, oi that we saw in the present and the second aorist. Or we can have these forms, eas, aeon with a new movable, and aeon. All right. Now let's look at the first aorist optative middle. This is super easy, right? It's that same mean sa ta, nethastha, and ta, with the intervocalic sigma there dropping out. And we end up with, we have another extra accent here. All right, we end up with paideus simene, paideus sio, paideus saito, paideus simatha, paideus sisva, paideus santo. Okay. Finally, the aorist passive. So sixth principal part, remove any augment, remove the personal endings and get your stem. And here we go. And you're going to recognize these personal endings, right? Ain, ace, a, aim, and a to ason. Before the personal endings, we have this epsilon iota. So we end up with paideuthein, paideutheis, paideuthea, paideutheamen, paideutheate, paideutheason. Okay, that's the aorist optative passive. We do need the present optative of Amy, and if you take a look, right, it has alternative forms in the plural, but here's the ain, ace, a, amen, a to ason, right, with this epsilon iota in front of it, so it looks just like the endings we just saw for the aorist passive optative. And then we have these alternative forms here, amen, a to an. Okay. All right, so let's look at two ways that we can use these new optative forms. And first off comes the optative of wish. This is actually the use that gives its name to the optative move because the verb optare in Latin means to wish. So here it is, the optative of wish, or the optative optative. It can come in the aorist or present optative with a difference in aspect. And often it's accompanied by aetha or agar, but not always. And if there's a negative, the negative is ne. So let's look at these examples. Aetha biblia graphoimen. Would that we were writing books. I hope that we'll be writing books. The optative expresses a wish for the future. Okay, so Aetha biblia graphoimen. Would that we were writing books. I wish that we would be writing books. Agar fugoite tus polemius. Would that you flee the enemies. I hope that you flee the enemies. Trepsio estain oikian. Would that you betake yourself into the house. Ne blethaeson hoi hippoi. May the horses not be hit. I hope that the horses aren't hit. Would that the horses not be hit. Okay, now let's look at the potential optative, which does just exactly what it says on the tin, right? It expresses potential. And again, you can have it with the present or the aorist octave with a difference in aspect. And the negative for the potential optative is oo. So, first example, philoienon ekanein tein hippon. I might love, or I might be loving that horse, right? I could be loving that horse. Ude ekanein tein hippon u polesion. So, nobody wouldn't buy that horse. Anybody would buy that horse. Upoton tinethe te hupoton polemneon. You would never be honored by those, or by the enemies. You would never be honored by the enemies. You might never be honored by the enemies. You may never be honored by the enemies. Okay, good. All right. That is it for forms of the optative and independent uses of the optative.